Thank you so much, Eban, Kristina, and Jorge for joining us today. I'm super excited about having this conversation. Each of you are doing some really amazing work, as well as, Eban, I'm excited for you to share a really amazing resource and pathway for people listening, which is the Bard MBA in Sustainability. So to kick it off, I'd love for each of you to share a little bit about who you are and the work that you're doing. So we'll start with Eban.
Well, Marcus, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and no more important thing to be talking about. So I'm an economist, and I'm director of graduate programs in sustainability at Bard College. We offer, I like to think of it as, how are people going to sort of make an impact in the world? And there's really three ways. There's education, that's changing minds. We have an M.Ed in environmental education. There's policy, and that's changing the rules, and we offer MS degrees in environmental policy and climate science and policy. And then there's the subject of today's conversation, which is really changing the game, and that's what business has got to do, because no matter how many rules we change and no matter how many minds we change, at the end of the day, business has got to figure out how we're going to put food on the table, keep the lights on, and do that in a way that not only cuts global warming pollution and plastics pollution and water pollution by 80 to 90%, but fundamentally also treats workers and communities and suppliers with justice and with respect, because we can't be talking about, ecologically responsible companies that aren't also in these times really socially engaged.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Kristina?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Kristina Kohl. I'm the Employee and Organizations Professor for the Bard MBA in Sustainability. I'm also the managing principal of HRComputes. We are a boutique consulting firm that works at the intersection of digital transformation and DEI initiatives and really driving impact with people in your organization. And I'm also an author, so I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation today.
And as we just talked about right before this recording, you just got a book deal, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Excited for you to chat a little bit more about, talk a little bit more about it. And Jorge?
Hi, Marcos. Thanks for having me as well. My name is Jorge Fontanez. I am the clinical professor of marketing at the Bard MBA and Sustainability program, where I teach stakeholders in marketing. And I'm also the founder of Marca Studio, which is my consultancy to founders of color, social enterprises that are leading change for the next generation and working alongside foundations, brands, and nonprofits. I have had quite a passion for finding ways in which to create more equity for people of color, understanding that we have a huge wealth gap that continues to keep founders in particular from being able to cultivate and bring in investment for their startup organizations and truly bringing an idea to market, as well as understanding that for many small businesses, those businesses that gain access to capital do well, but those that gain access to mentors and expertise actually exceed the 10-year survival rate by 70%. And so that's also part of my mission.
Awesome. Thank you all again for joining us, and also just the amazing work that you're doing. And I can't wait to dive into each of those. And I think as we've been having these conversations with a focus on the summit being building anti-racist businesses, I think at the end of the day, we're trying to create a just and equitable economy. And we kind of think about public, private, as well as the social sector, but I think an integral part of that infrastructure and that connective tissue is academia, and being able to train the next generation of anti-racist business leaders. So I'd love to kick it off to Eban, and I'd love for you to dive into a little bit more about what Bard offers and how you're training this next generation of leaders.
Yeah, Marcus, we've seen a lot of brands sort of step up around issues of Black Lives Matter and issuing letters of support and whatnot. And that's a good thing. Obviously, a lot of people question the depth of that commitment. Is it purpose washing? But what we do at the Bard MBA is really, we set ourselves up really to take advantage of of brands saying that they have social purpose, they have environmental purpose, and really trying to provide them the leaders who can make that a reality. Because you can say that, but how do you actually build a business that's in business to solve social and environmental problems? Gotta be financially successful, if you're a for-profit business, or even if you're a nonprofit, you've really got to be thinking about how am I going to raise the funds to support my initiative. So profitability, financial success, goes without saying that has to happen. But how do you really do that in the service of social and environmental purpose? And that's really what's unique about the Bard MBA program. We're really one of a handful of graduate business programs around the world that is fully integrating that focus on mission and sustainability into a core MBA. I mean, the good news is every MBA program, now at least has a person or a class or a thing related to purpose or sustainability or mission. The bad news is, they're largely stuck in the 20th century. Most of their faculty are still believe in a single bottom line, the whole mentality that's got us into this mess that we're in the first place. So Bard's really in a position to really move the needle in terms of thinking about what does it mean to train future business leaders who are going to put purpose and mission first, and in particular, how can they be effective anti-racist business leaders when they step into those roles? Yeah,
and we'll dive into what Jorge and Kristina teach and how they're preparing those. And can you give a little bit of a framework on if someone goes to the Bard program, what does that look like, or what are some of the trainings and programs that looks like in terms of training people to be anti-racist? And
so Bard's curriculum, kind of looks like a conventional MBA curriculum in the sense that we teach marketing and finance, employees and organizations, strategy, accounting. But since our inception, every one of those courses and the tools that you learn in those courses have been wrapped around the idea of, okay, how do I use those tools to build businesses that are in business to solve social and environmental problems? And with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've been engaged, internally for a number of years thinking about how does this piece fit in? Because I would say that our history is really coming out of a concern about issues of climate change, water pollution, more conventional social justice issues, healthcare, access to housing. But racism in particular, and systemic racism, how can a business really make a change in the world? And we've been doing some thinking about that. And there's really three big buckets where business can move the needle. The first relates to kind of internal practices, right? So how do you break down barriers and the structures of systematic racism within your organization? The second piece is, what about your business model, right? Can you redesign what you're doing so that you can actually begin to break down barriers in society through the business work you're doing? One of our graduates, for example, has been working for a battery company, and obviously, great impacts on climate change, but they're self-consciously orienting their work around low-income communities, resilience, working with communities in places like Puerto Rico, and say, we're producing a battery, we can make choices about what customers we're going to go after, and we're being explicit that we want to use our technology to address issues of social justice. And then the final piece is, and Jorge has been great about sort of pointing this out, is really about brands sort of taking it up a level in terms of their public commitment, right? Really being allies with organizations in the Black Lives Matter movement, and advocating for changes in public policy, because ultimately that has got to happen, and business needs to step up, and this is a challenge, right? Because businesses are typically shy about engaging in social issues that don't directly affect their bottom line. But increasingly, this is a responsibility that mission-driven businesses have to take on, whether it's climate change or questions of racial justice.
Yeah.
So those are the three areas, and we've been thinking about that as a faculty and trying to figure out how can we strengthen our teaching to support our students to be able to go out and do those things when they leave our program.
Yeah, and I want to dive into the how Kristina and Jorge are both contributing to that training. And I think the thing, based on kind of the conversations that we've been having, is a lot of organizations, we've been focused on how do organizations make these shifts and try to integrate these practices and policies, and that's having those conversations internally. But I think the interesting thing, what the Bard MBA program does, is it trains them so that when people hire that talent directly from Bard, they're already prepared to a large extent to start contributing to the organization in this kind of way, and or they're already creating businesses on their own with this lens in mind. So Kristina, I'd love for you to just share what are kind of the programming that you end up teaching in Bard to equip students.
Sure, happy to share that. The Employees and Organizations class has always looked at the intersectionality of the Sustainable Development Goals around the social issues and the environmental issues, and how that impacts the profitability issues. And we do that in a variety of ways. We start by looking at an organization as a system and understanding that the systems that you have in your organization will definitely impact the outcome. And culture is part of that system. So what is the culture of your organization? What are the priorities? And how is all of that communicated? How is that supported? What is prioritized? What are the processes? All of those things are discussed in the class. And then we kind of break it down a little further into understanding the people side of it. What is the employee life cycle? How do you engage talent? How do you recruit talent? And how does diversity, equity, and inclusion become part of all these conversations? Because what we've seen is we've spent over 20 years talking about DEI. Many organizations have DEI training, sexual harassment training, but there hasn't really been a shift. The numbers continually show very poor percentages. Great article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about Black CEOs. And I think Black CEOs percentage is at 4%. And it's not as if it was, as if it's a growing, it's not going anywhere. And the same thing from a gender perspective. So we take a look at all of those things and we create opportunities to have conversations around these topics and lay out some models and ideas of how to address them. Which I won't go into because they're, many and sundry, but we also create opportunities for students to bring their own ideas, to investigate outside of the classroom. We are involved with the Aim to Flourish project, where students can select a business and highlight what that business is doing to impact the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that can be a broad range of organizations, that can be a broad range of ethnicity of owners. It's really an opportunity for them to explore and contribute in the classroom, as well as modeling behavior in the class itself. And how do we interact as teams? How do we have difficult conversations? What are our guidelines? How do we make sure that we can reframe questions or ask if someone is, put off a little bit by how something is framed or questioned in a classroom. So all of that behavior is modeled as well.
Awesome. And Jorge, can you share a little bit? I have definitely some follow-up questions, but Jorge, can you share a little bit about the framework that you provide in terms of your classes?
Sure. Yes, Marcos. So I'll say that I think where Kristina also speaks about culture of organizations, I look to what is the mindset of leaders within an organization, and what are the decision-making points that marketers in particular need to consider as they're crafting a strategy. And so my theory of change is very much anchored on the fact that marketing as a discipline has existed for a long time. Our focus on sustainability issues also in particular have been well within our reach and in terms of understanding, but it really hasn't been until technology and the internet has accelerated and created an environment where we're seeing increased transparency around the issues that brands encounter in their day-to-day business, how that impacts reputation of those brands, and then how that ultimately can erode public trust, as well as trust in employees and other stakeholders of the firm. And so that at its core is the framework of marketing, is understanding how to protect a brand's reputation and to account for all of the negative externalities that may be impacting stakeholders that are not just your customers.
Gotcha. And I think for both Jorge and Kristina, you're reminding there's kind of two major elements, pillars. I'd love to get your thoughts. One is kind of these systems and processes and kind of this infrastructure and these strategies, and that is a little bit more concrete, right? And then we're also having these, but an organization is made up of people, right? And those people are in relation to each other, and relationships, one, are messy because you're dealing with emotions, and two, everybody brings their own baggage from previous relationships into the organization, right? So how are these kind of strategies and infrastructure setting up the context for spaces where you can have those difficult conversations? How are you preparing students to, I think mentioned earlier, Jorge, earlier, about being uncomfortable and being okay with that comfortability? How are each of you and your work and your classes preparing students for that? You can kick it off with Kristina.
I think it's really about cases that you choose and issues that you bring up, and then setting frameworks to have the conversation and agreeing on some ground rules, agreeing on psychological safety, giving people safe spaces to say what they really need to say without being attacked in an environment. So it's really, from my perspective, it's about facilitating and, moderating the ground rules that we lay out to have the conversations. And I think Bard students are very well equipped to have these conversations. I do teach in the last semester, so they've benefited from all of my colleagues' training, for several years. But they're very respectful of one another, and they're very good from this program at having difficult conversations. And I think it really just stems from doing it, practicing it, and facilitating it.
Yeah, and you're making me think about us, and also the work that you do outside of Bard is setting up those systems and policies and kind of documentation. It just reminds me of when I engage with a partnership or a contract, I think of those as just like relationship savers, because everything is kind of laid out. Like you said, what are the guidelines? What are the ways in which we're going to have this conversation? And that helps facilitate or create those safe spaces that you talked about. What about you, Jorge?
So I think Kristina and I think similarly. This year I experimented in my course with a couple of new aspects. One was having my students weigh in on an equity and inclusion statement for my course that directly linked the shared agreements around how we might have open and not just safe dialogue, but giving us permission to have uncomfortable conversations and laying out some ground rules that we could all agree to. That's the first point, as well as understanding kind of as a sub-bullet of that our intention actually is to put storytelling at the center, right? This is the core tenet of marketing, is understanding how stories create change and change hearts and minds. And that comes with a recognition that we are often propagating content, stories, and even case studies whose protagonists are written by white authors and are not often diverse in terms of the protagonists within those cases. And that too is our challenge as faculty. And so we agreed to try and center diverse voices in order to not fall into the complacency of having dominant ideologies influence our decision-making and understanding of business. So that, first and foremost, was an important part of how we started the semester. The second is grounding our understanding of business in history. How did we get here? The advent and introduction of new technology is not new, as in terms of being a disruptor. The cotton gin was a disruptor of its time. It also created the opportunity for low cost and free labor to exist in order for plantation owners to get to the highest output that they had ever seen, and created an economy that the world had never seen before, right? And so using that as an example, as an analogy, is something that we can also look to today's business and understanding how technology companies might be perpetuating those same types of systems, exploring then the disparities, and yeah, having open conversations, because a lot of those questions are still left unanswered, and it really is our opportunities to shape the business leader's mindset.
Great. And so both of you have talked about how in many ways you're preparing Bard MBA students, and I'd love to kind of take it out of that into the real world. And Jorge, I'd love to have a follow-up question. I think it's interesting, we were having a conversation before we started recording about brands, and I think Eban pointed out, it's great that brands are putting like Black Lives Matter, kind of black images, and there is some movement in that direction. But what does that look like from a marketing standpoint in terms of, previously it was greenwashing, and now it may be purpose washing, or even social justice washing? And how do you work with brands, or should brands think about if they're trying to market in an ethical and think about ethical way, as well as thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So I call it woke washing, and a lot of people call it woke washing. I did not coin the term, but I like the term, because it does reflect what is happening in our society, which is that we're seeing a greater sense of awareness. And that's important, right? That's important. It's a principal tenet of marketing as well, as we create awareness about our brands in order to create more interest and consideration to get people to buy our products and services. So it is not a surprise that brands would find a way to participate in the conversation. But this is hard work. And so my advice to brands is to look internally and begin to not just be in dialogue about how the business may be perpetuating systems of inequity, but also understanding a firm's history. This is where I think a case study can be a nice safe space. We've been studying the cocoa supply chain, which has a long history of having what we call today modern slavery existing in its systems, that we may no longer see enslaved people being forced to farm, but what that looks like today is very different. And so what is the responsibility of chocolate makers to eradicate and address modern slavery issues globally? Another huge issue of our time, being that we operate in a global marketplace, is having arm's length reach and distance from understanding our suppliers and having a relationship with our suppliers. And so we raise these questions in that context. And I think that brands who are, we should applaud brands who are making the steps to be supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, but it must come with an understanding that each brand has its own work to do, and the actions that will come later, I think, will be what consumers and the public writ large will be looking for as evidence of how they're following through on those commitments.
Gotcha. And Kristina, can you share a little bit about the work that you're doing with HRComputes? I know that we talked about creating resources and to make data-driven decisions. So we'd love to hear a little bit how you all work with companies.
Sure. We really focus on helping organizations understand their people data and understand how that impacts their strategic outcomes. I think Eban mentioned at the beginning, we talk a lot about agility and resilience. I think the life span for an S&P 500 company was about 60 years in the 30s, and it's now down like to 10. I mean, it's so quick how everything moves and how quickly you need to adapt. So we really try to help organizations gather data, understand their data, and make informed decisions based on that data. And a lot of times when you're talking about, diversity, people want to play a numbers game, but you really have to take it to what I like to call belonging. And how do you create a culture where people both want to come to work for you? Because as Jorge says, you are living your mission. Whatever you're putting out with your marketing is what people are doing in their jobs every day. There isn't a misalignment between the outer image that you're giving of your organization and the inner image that you're living every day. And that transparency and that alignment is really crucial. It's especially crucial for our graduates. I mean, they want purpose, but they also want to feel authentic in what they're doing every day. So, basically it's taking data and really beginning to understand how you've made decisions, who's been put into leadership programs, how those people have been selected, and moving from people's opinions and subjective opinions to more data-driven results and, actions based on actual performance and outcomes that align with that.
And what are some of the challenges, I depending on the type of organization that and businesses, and we'll go for Jorge as well, that you work with, what are some of the common challenges that you're seeing now in the context of 2020 that businesses are facing to try to integrate these practices?
Well, I think back to the Wall Street Journal, and if I misquote this, I apologize, but I think the CEO of Wells Fargo said they really would like to hire more Black executives, but they couldn't find any. I think that came out like last week. I mean, that mentality that it's a pipeline problem, it's partially a pipeline problem, but it's mainly a locus of opportunity problem. And so I think that there is a definite mindset change that has to take place. As much as we've talked about this, senior leadership really needs to be on board, and they really need to put structures in place to cascade it down to middle management. Many years ago, we worked on a technology project for a large global pharmaceutical firm. They were trying to institutionalize flexible work because they had flexible work policies all over the place, and they ended up getting sued. So what happened was, the middle level managers were where the problems were happening because they were all giving different answers to people asking for flexible work in the same type of environment. So it's education, it's process improvement, it's really alignment of culture and action to make this all move forward. So you really have to look at what you're doing, deeply look at what you're doing. How are you recruiting? Where are you recruiting? Are you building opportunities for people in your community? Are you trying to reflect your community in the demographic mix of your employees? And really take a deep and hard looks at what you're doing. As Jorge said, this is not easy. This requires you to really break your current system and build it back with something new. And you may not get it right the first time. I think with data, there's the famous case of, I believe it was Amazon. A lot of times when you build an algorithm, you build the algorithm based on the data that you've collected over time. Well, Amazon had a very biased hiring policy. So the algorithm generated very biased results. So you really have to understand what you're doing with technology, how you're using it, how it's going to help you, how it's going to hurt you. I have another example of a partner of ours, Phenom People. They have a platform that allows people to apply internally for internal gigs, short-term assignments as stretch assignments. So that it's out there, it's public information. It's not just one manager saying, oh, Bob would be good for this, I like Bob, because that's so often how people get the opportunity. It's that they get recommended, they have a mentor, they have a sponsor, and someone else doesn't. So it's about all of those components to really break what's happening. And it's both internally focused and externally focused.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you shared the CEO comment. There was a politician, well, AOC, that shared, well, maybe the problem is that the CEO isn't good enough to find that talent, and kind of flipping it on the CEO's problem rather than it being a pipeline talent, a pipeline problem. Jorge, I would love for you to share, like, what are some of the challenges that you see brands facing kind of now in this midst of 2020, for lack of a better word, chaos?
Yeah, so let me say that I want to say that brands, sorry, is the background noise too much? Okay, hopefully.
You're good.
Okay, we've got multiple conversations in my household today. So yeah, the first thing I want to say again is that brands are on a journey. And PwC has done some good work to lay out what that journey looks like. They call it the sustainability continuum. And we talk about how brands on the beginning of the journey are largely looking at issues of compliance and mandated laws and what it means, what is the license to operate in a particular region of the world. At the top of that continuum is engaging your stakeholders in a co-creative value creative exchange where they are participating in your business. It is not siloed. And so I think it's important for us to, if we might say that we give, every person, every individual's on their journey, that brands are too. The second point is looking at inside the organization. So whereas Kristina, shed light on the issues of the pipeline, the issue around belonging also has to do with organizational structure and decision making. And so some of the organizations that I'm advising often have their multicultural division siloed from the rest of the organization. We need to get to a point where we are not segmenting on the side these communities of color different from the quote unquote mass market or general market. And this is still true for many brands, is that they are not looking at, they're only looking at demographics as a signal for which audiences to invest behind. But instead, our society is becoming more pluralistic and complex and intersectional, all of the words of modern day. And so speaking to authenticity, your customers will know when you are not operating in a way that speaks to them. The last thing I'll say is, yes, you're right, Marcos. The pandemic has highlighted incredible disparities for communities of color, both in terms of the impact of the coronavirus itself, as well as disproportionate impact for who has experienced job loss. And certainly the number today in New York is something like, I think 6,000 small businesses have permanently closed. And the numbers increasingly are disproportionately, again, impacting communities of color and women-owned businesses. And so this is a real challenge, I think, for large brands to understand what is their supplier diversity commitments. How do they continue to not only invite small businesses to participate in the procurement process, but actually begin to make commitments on absolute dollars allocated to small business owners as part of their portfolio. And I think this is a conversation that we'll see more of.
Absolutely. And I think what's happened in 2020 has set in some ways the conditions for it, and it's kind of forced businesses to have that conversation. Jorge and Kristina, thank you so much for the awesome work you're doing outside in your own individual organizations as well as Bard. And even to wrap it up, I'd love to share with the audience, what are the type of people that apply to Bard? What's the type of students that flourish at a Bard MBA program?
Well, we have two criteria for a mission. We're looking for smart people that want to change the world. And that's who our students are. And by smart people, I don't mean people who get 4.0s on their grade point averages, because those tend to be folks who aren't particularly good at changing the world. But folks who really want to engage with our fabulous professors and really absorb the material and figure out what we can teach them and take it out into the world. And just some examples around this issue of kind of looking internally. This year, our students, our DEI committee, student-driven, recommended that the faculty in each class come up with 3 concepts that they were teaching in their class that was going to make the students become better anti-racist business leaders. So they challenged the faculty to be very concrete in terms of saying, here's what I'm teaching you that's going to support your effort going forward. And that's in economics, that's in accounting, that's in strategy, that's in entrepreneurship. And the faculty are engaged in a dialogue sparked certainly by that student interest. So we're developing kind of a toolkit of what, what the tools are that business school ought to be teaching to make people better anti-racist leaders. And on another front, and this is kind of changing the business model internally, we're the only MBA program in the world that offers and in fact requires a year-long course in sustainability consulting. So we have a 9-month class where students work, really beginning their first day of business school with, JetBlue or Siemens Wind or Unilever or Cliff Bar, Eileen Fisher. But this year we decided to do some outreach because we realized we weren't getting Black-owned businesses or a substantial number of BIPOC serving businesses. And so we made a targeted effort in our RFP process. We got a bunch of great applicants. And I think something like 35 to 40% of the projects this year are having our students work in support of Black-owned or BIPOC focused communities. And that's part of the training too, right? Is to get our students used to doing that kind of searching to build a more inclusive supply chain, for example, as Jorge was talking about. So those are the kind of students we get. It's the students who are pushing us, who want to be and learn how to manage inclusive organizations, flat organizations, organizations that engage employees and other stakeholders in decision making. That's who our people are.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eban, Jorge, and Kristina, for sharing all your amazing stories and work that you're doing. And also just your work in training the next generation of business leaders that will come in with that mindfulness intention of leading organizations to be anti-racist. So thank you all so much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Marcos.
Thanks a lot.